The beep of the heart monitor was a frantic, useless bird trapped in the room. It was the only sound that dared to be loud in the sterile quiet of the ICU. Brenda, the charge nurse with a face permanently pinched from disapproval, was speaking again. Her voice was a low drill, aimed directly at Layla. "Did you even check his output? You can't just chart scant. Dr. Evans needs a number. Not your best guess. You're 18, not 12. Act like it." Layla didn't look up from the patient's chart. Her pen scratched against the paper, precise and steady. 32 milliliters over the last hour. "I was just about to document it." She kept her voice even, a flat line to counter the frantic beeping of the machine. It was a skill she was perfecting. In this world of controlled panic and casual cruelty, calm was armor. She was the new nurse, the quiet one, the youngest on the floor by a decade. Her skin was the color of rich coffee, her hair braided into a neat crown that stayed out of her way. In her light blue scrubs, she felt both invisible and hypervisible, a ghost everyone watched. They saw her age, her silence, and assumed incompetence. They never saw her hands, which never shook. They never saw her eyes, which missed nothing. Brenda scoffed, the sound like static. "See that you do." She swept away, her orthopedic shoes squeaking in protest, leaving Layla in the wake of her cheap floral perfume. Layla finished her note, her handwriting small and perfect. She did a final check on the patient's foredrip, her movements economical and sure. She was good at her job. She knew it with a certainty that lived deep in her bones, a quiet fire they couldn't extinguish with their condescending words. She belonged in the chaos. She understood the language of failing bodies and the desperate science that fought to hold them together. That was when the building began to tremble. It started as a low hum, a vibration that worked its way up from the soles of her shoes. The water in the patient's bedside cup shivered. Then the hum grew into a deep, guttural roar that rattled the windows in their frames. It was not an earthquake. It was something mechanical, something heavy, descending from the sky. A helicopter. Here. Landing on the hospital's roof was reserved for life or death transfers, or for the kind of money that didn't ask for permission. Brenda and the others rushed to the window, their complaints forgotten. Layla stayed with her patient, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a silent reassurance. The roar of the blades cut out, leaving a ringing silence broken only by the frantic beeping of the monitor she'd been trying to ignore. Minutes later, the doors to the ICU swished open, not with the usual rush of doctors or frantic family members, but with a deliberate, unnerving calm. Two men in black suits entered first. They were built like brick walls, their faces blank, their eyes scanning the room with a predatory sweep that made the hair on Layla's arms stand up. They weren't security. They weren't police. They moved with a kind of ownership, as if the air itself belonged to them. Then he walked in. He was the center of the storm, the quiet eye around which the chaos spun. His suit was a deep charcoal gray, tailored so exquisitely it seemed molded to his frame. It was the kind of suit that cost more than her car, maybe more than her tuition. He moved with a liquid grace that was terrifying. It was the walk of a panther, utterly confident in its place at the top of the food chain. Layla's first coherent thought was about his hands. They were at his sides, relaxed, but she could see the clean lines of his knuckles, the manicured nails. They were hands that could sign a multi-million-dollar deal or snap a man's neck with equal ease. She didn't know how she knew that, she just did. Dr. Evans, who usually strode through the unit like a minor god, hurried toward him, his face a mixture of fear and deference. "Sir, this is a restricted area. I'm afraid you can't." The man in the charcoal suit didn't even look at him. His gaze was sweeping the room, cold and analytical. His eyes were dark, a shade of brown so deep they were almost black, and held a chilling stillness. They passed over Brenda, over the other nurses, and then they landed on Layla. And they stopped. It was like being pinned by a searchlight. She felt stripped bare, every bit of her quiet competence, her hidden strength, laid out for his inspection. He took a slow step into the room, his leather shoes making no sound on the linoleum. The air grew thick, heavy. The scent of ozone and something else, expensive cologne, cedar and smoke, cut through the antiseptic smell of the hospital. He spoke, his voice a low baritone that vibrated in the small space. It was calm, precise, and held an absolute, unbreakable authority. I need a nurse. One of my men is injured. Not here. You will come with me. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Dr. Evans sputtered. I'm sorry. That's completely against hospital policy. Our staff cannot leave the premises. We can have your man brought here. The emergency room is. The man finally turned his head, just slightly, to fix Dr. Evans with his gaze. The effect was instantaneous. The doctor's words died in his throat. A visible shiver ran through him. This is not a negotiation, the man said, his voice dropping even lower, if that were possible. He turned his attention back to Layla. You. Brenda stepped forward, a flicker of her usual arrogance returning. She's a trainee, a junior nurse. You'll want someone with more experience. I want her, he said, the words sharp and final. He looked directly at Layla, and in that moment, she understood. He wasn't looking for experience. He was looking for something else. He had seen the way she stood her ground, the way she didn't flinch, the way she met his gaze when everyone else looked away. He had seen her armor. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her hands remained steady at her sides. Her mind raced, cataloging the impossibility of it. This was Los Angeles. This was a hospital. Things like this didn't happen. Men in perfect suits with dead eyes didn't walk into an ICU and commandeer the staff. But it was happening. One of the brick wall men stepped toward her. She took an involuntary step back, bumping into the supply cart. The clatter of plastic sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. The man in the suit raised a single, elegant hand. The subordinate froze. Do not be alarmed, miss, he paused, his gaze flicking to the name tag clipped to her scrubs. Layla. He said her name differently. Not like her instructors, or Brenda's condescending drawl. He said it like it was a key, something he was testing in a lock. The sound of it from his lips was both intimate and threatening. You'll be compensated for your time. And you'll be returned. But right now, a man's life depends on your cooperation. He was lying. She knew it. The life of one of his men was not his primary concern. Control was. Getting what he wanted, precisely when and how he wanted it, was. She was a tool he had selected. She had no choice. She knew that. Arguing would be pointless. Screaming would be worse. These were not men who could be reasoned with. They were a force of nature. So she did the only thing she could. She met his gaze, lifted her chin, and gave a single, sharp nod. His lips quirked, a ghost of a smile that held no warmth. It was an expression of victory. He had chosen correctly. Get your kit, he commanded softly. She turned, her movement stiff, and grabbed the trauma bag from the supply closet. It was heavy, filled with everything needed to stabilize a life, hanging by a thread. As she turned back, the two men were already moving, clearing a path for her. For him. The entire ICU staff was frozen, watching in stunned silence as the quiet new nurse was escorted out by the most dangerous man they had ever seen. The elevator ride down to the parking garage was silent. The air was so thick with tension Layla could barely breathe. He stood beside her, not touching, but she could feel the heat radiating from him, the sheer physical presence of him. The cedar and smoke of his cologne filled the small space, and she found herself cataloging it, memorizing it, as if it were a clue. The doors opened onto a private, underground level. A sleek black sedan, so polished it looked like a pool of ink, was waiting, the engine purring. One of the men opened the back door. Her boss, Kwon Jinwoo, she'd heard Dr. Evans whisper his name in terror, gestured for her to get in. She slid onto the cool leather seat. He got in after her, and the door closed with a solid, final thud. It sealed them in, shutting out the world. Her world. The quiet, orderly life of shifts and charts and saving people within the rules was gone. She was in his world now, and she had a terrifying feeling that in his world, there were no rules at all. The car pulled away, accelerating smoothly into the Los Angeles night, and she was left with the reflection of her own wide eyes in the tinted window, a girl in blue scrubs being driven into the heart of a darkness she was not prepared for. The car moved through the city with an effortless speed, ignoring traffic laws as if they were mere suggestions. They didn't drive to another hospital. They drove up into the Hollywood Hills, to a house that wasn't a house but a fortress of glass and steel perched on the edge of a cliff. It overlooked the sprawling galaxy of city lights below, a silent, godlike vantage point. Inside, the opulence was breathtaking and cold. Marble floors, minimalist furniture, and vast windows that drank in the view. But there was a tension coiling beneath the surface, the scent of something metallic and faintly sweet.
Blood.
They led her to a large, open room that looked like it belonged in a design magazine. On a long, low sofa of white leather lay a man. His suit was ruined, soaked through with red. Another man, his face grim, was pressing down on a makeshift bandage on his abdomen. "He's losing too much, boss," the grim-faced man said, not looking up. Kwon Jinwoo's focus was entirely on Layla. "Do your work," he said. It was the same tone he'd used in the hospital, the voice of a man who had never been disobeyed. Layla dropped the trauma bag and was at the man's side in an instant. The professionalism she wore like armor clicked into place. The fear receded, replaced by a sharp, clear focus. This, she understood. A body in crisis. A life slipping away. "I need light. A lot more of it," she commanded, her voice crisp. "And boiled water. Clean towels. And whatever you have that's close to surgical-grade antiseptic." For a second, no one moved. Then Jinwoo gave a sharp nod, and his men scrambled to obey her. She cut away the fabric of the man's shirt and trousers. The wound was a deep, ragged gash, a knife wound, not a bullet. It was bleeding profusely. His pulse was thready, his skin clammy. He was going into shock. "I need to start a line now," she said, pulling an IV kit from her bag. She worked with swift, practiced efficiency, finding a vein in his arm that was collapsing, her touch both gentle and firm. As the saline solution began to drip, she turned her attention back to the wound. It was deep. He needed a surgeon, a proper operating room. All she could do was buy him time. She spent the next hour working, cleaning the wound, packing it, stitching the superficial layers to stanch the bleeding. Jinwoo stood in the corner of the room, watching her. He never moved. He was a statue carved from shadows, his dark eyes tracking her every motion. She could feel his gaze on her hands as she deftly tied off a suture, on her face as she concentrated. It was an unnerving, intense scrutiny. He wasn't just watching a nurse save his man. He was dissecting her, learning how she worked, how she thought under pressure. The injured man was delirious, muttering in Korean. Layla didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone of pain and fear. At one point, he cried out a name.
"Minyon hoi koitsi seo minyon."
A flicker of something crossed Jinwoo's face. It was so fast, she almost missed it. A tightening around his eyes, a muscle that jumped in his jaw. It was the first crack she'd seen in his cold, impenetrable facade. A wound. He had one too. This man, who seemed to control everything, carried a failure he couldn't fix. It was a name, a ghost in the room with them. Once the man was stabilized, his breathing evening out, his vitals holding steady, Layla finally sat back on her heels. Her scrubs were stained with a stranger's blood. Her muscles ached. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving a hollow exhaustion in its place. That was when the first gunshot echoed from outside. It was sharp, distinct, followed by a spray of automatic fire. The massive window overlooking the city exploded inward, showering the marble floor with a cascade of glittering, deadly diamonds. Jinwoo's men moved instantly, returning fire, shouting orders. Jinwoo was at her side in a heartbeat. He grabbed her arm, his grip like steel, and pulled her down behind the heavy sofa. "Stay down," he snarled, his body shielding hers from the open space. The air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the smell of cordite. She was pressed against him, the hard lines of his body a solid wall between her and the chaos. She could feel the coiled power in him, the way he moved with the lethal grace she'd first noticed. This was his language. Violence was his native tongue. In the middle of the firefight, a thought, clear as a bell, cut through her fear. There was a service door she'd seen when they brought in the water. It led to a side garden. In the chaos, no one was watching it. She could run. She could slip out, lose herself in the winding canyon roads, and be gone. It was her chance. Her one and only chance to escape this nightmare. But then she heard a gurgle. She risked a look over the top of the sofa. The man she had just spent an hour saving had torn his fore out in a panic. The wound on his abdomen was bleeding freely again, soaking through the fresh bandages. The monitor she'd hooked him up to was screaming a high, thin alarm. He was crashing. She looked at the service door. Freedom. Then she looked at the dying man. A life.
Her choice.
Damn it. Cover me, she said, her voice tight. Jin-woo looked down at her, his dark eyes wide with surprise in the strobing flashes of muzzle fire. What? He's bleeding out. I have to get to him, she said, already moving. She didn't wait for his permission. She scrambled on her hands and knees, keeping low, the sound of bullets whistling over her head. She reached the man, her hands immediately going to the wound, applying pressure. She reinserted the fore into his other arm, her fingers working surely despite the tremors running through her body. She made a deliberate choice. She chose the oath she had taken over her own survival. The firefight ended as abruptly as it began. The silence that fell was heavier, more menacing than the noise had been. One of Jin-woo's men gave an all-clear. Jin-woo rose, his own gun now in his hand, a sleek, black instrument of death. He scanned the room, his expression cold and assessing. Then his eyes fell on her. She was still on the floor, her hands covered in blood, holding pressure on his man's wound, keeping him alive. He walked over to her, his shadow falling across her. He stood there for a long moment, just looking down. She expected anger, a reprimand for her recklessness. Instead, he knelt in front of her, amidst the shattered glass and the smell of gunpowder. He reached out, not to help, not to pull her up, but to gently push a stray braid back from her face. His fingers were surprisingly warm against her skin. It was a small, almost deniable gesture of something. Not tenderness, not kindness. It was acknowledgement. He had seen what she'd done. He had seen her choose to stay. His dark eyes held hers, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the cold control. It was a flicker of grudging respect. And something else. Something possessive and dangerous. He had seen her strength, and now he wanted to own it. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken words. The city lights twinkled through the shattered window, a distant, beautiful world she no longer belonged to. That was the moment she knew she wasn't just a tool he was using for a night. She was a complication he now had to solve. And Kwon Jin-woo did not leave problems unsolved. He moved her after that. Not back to her life, but deeper into his. The house in the hills was compromised. They left in a different black car, this one armored, the windows thick enough to stop a bullet. They drove to a sleek, anonymous skyscraper in the heart of Koreatown, ascending in a private elevator to the penthouse that occupied the entire top floor. This was his real home. It was even more sterile and luxurious than the last place, a cage of glass and chrome overlooking the entire city. It was beautiful and utterly isolating. He showed her to a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment, with a wall of windows and a bed that looked like a cloud. "You will stay here," he said. It was not a suggestion. "It is the only place I can guarantee your safety. My safety." Layla's voice was sharp, laced with an irony that was lost on him. "I was safe before you walked into my hospital." A muscle worked in his jaw. "The men who attacked tonight are from a rival organization. They have seen you. They now consider you a pressure point. To leave you on your own would be a death sentence," he said it so calmly, a simple statement of fact. Her life was over. The Layla who worried about Brenda's condescending remarks and charting patient output was gone. She had been erased in a single night. A cold fury, sharp and clean, rose in her throat. She spent the next few days in that gilded cage. His men were ghosts, silent and watchful. They brought her food, clothes that appeared in the closet, expensive, minimalist pieces in silk and cashmere that felt alien against her skin. Jin-woo himself was a phantom. He was there in the penthouse, but he was always in his office, on the phone, his voice a low, dangerous murmur of Korean. She was a prisoner, but she was not passive. She watched. She listened. She learned the rhythm of the household, the changing of the guards, the silent codes they used. Her mind, trained to observe the minute details of a patient's condition, now turned that focus to her captor and his world. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered out of her room. The penthouse was silent, dark except for the city lights painting patterns on the floor. A sliver of light shone from under the door of his office. Drawn by a morbid curiosity, she crept closer. The door was ajar. She could hear his voice, speaking in English this time, cold and precise.
It was a business call.
A brutal one. The shipment is secure, he was saying. The losses were acceptable. Yes, he was dealt with. His family has been sent a message they will not forget. Layla's blood ran cold. Dealt with. A message. She knew what those words meant. This wasn't just about turf wars and rival gangs. This was a man who ruled an empire through fear and surgical violence. The calm, controlled man who had touched her face with such surprising gentleness was a monster. She backed away from the door, her heart hammering. She had to get out. The knowledge was a physical weight, crushing her. As she turned, she knocked over a small porcelain vase on a side table. It shattered on the marble floor with a sound that seemed to explode in the silence. The office door flew open. Jin-woo stood there, silhouetted against the light. He saw her, saw the shattered vase, and his eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. He was across the space in 3 long strides, his hand clamping around her upper arm. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered, her voice trembling. He knew she was lying. His gaze was sharp, accusatory. He knew she had been listening. He dragged her into his office, the door clicking shut behind them. On his desk, a laptop was open.
On the screen was a file.
And on that file was her face. It was a complete dossier. Her high school records, her nursing school application, her address, her mother's address in Atlanta. Photos of her at her graduation. He hadn't just chosen her at random. He had investigated her. Maybe not before he took her, but certainly in the days since. He had been deciding what to do with her. Seeing it all laid out like that, her entire life reduced to a file on a killer's computer, broke something inside her. "You are looking into me," she said, her voice flat. "I am a careful man," he replied, his grip on her arm not loosening. "Am I a liability to be dealt with?" she asked, throwing his own cold words back at him. His eyes flashed. He pulled her closer, his face inches from hers. The scent of him, cedar and smoke, was overwhelming. "Do not mistake my patience for weakness, Layla. You are alive because I allow it. Do not make me regret that decision." The threat hung between them, thick and suffocating. This was the real him, the man who sent messages to families. The next day, he decided she needed to get out of the penthouse. He said it was for her own well-being, but she knew it was a test, a way to reassert his control. They went out in an armored convoy, a bubble of deadly security moving through the city. It was as they were crossing a bridge over the LA River that all hell broke loose. A garbage truck slammed into the lead car, sending it spinning into the railing. Simultaneously, a van screeched to a halt behind them, men with automatic weapons pouring out. It was an ambush, a professional one. Jin-woo shoved her to the floor of the car just as the windows on her side spiderwebbed with bullet impacts. "Stay down," he roared. The car was a metal coffin, bullets pinging off the exterior. One of his men in the front seat was hit, slumping over with a wet sigh. One of the attackers managed to wrench her door open. A hand grabbed her ankle, trying to drag her out. She screamed, kicking wildly. Jin-woo moved over the seat with a terrifying speed. He fired 2 shots, the sound deafening inside the car. The hand on her ankle went limp. But another attacker was there, raising his weapon. There was no time. Jin-woo threw himself over her, his body a shield, bracing for the impact. Layla's mind went white with a single, clear thought: no. Her hand fumbled in the medical kit she now carried everywhere. Her fingers closed around a syringe and a vial of epinephrine. It was for cardiac arrest. A massive dose, injected directly, could cause one. Without thinking, only acting, she lunged forward, under Jin Woo's arm, and plunged the needle deep into the exposed thigh of the man leaning into the car. He screamed, a strangled, shocked sound. His eyes went wide, his gun falling from his hands. He clutched at his chest, his whole body convulsing, and then he collapsed backward onto the pavement. She had crossed a line. She, a nurse trained to save lives, had just taken one. Or had come close enough that it made no difference. The knowledge was a brand on her soul. She could never go back. The remaining attackers were dispatched by Jin Woo's men. In the sudden, ringing silence, there was only the sound of their harsh breathing in the car. Jin Woo slowly pushed himself off her. He had a bloody graze on his temple, where a piece of shrapnel had hit him. He looked from the convulsing man on the ground to the syringe still clutched in her hand. He looked at her, and his eyes were dark, unreadable pools. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the acrid tang of gunpowder. Adrenaline was a wild, screaming thing in her veins. He reached out and took the syringe from her trembling fingers. He didn't speak for a long time. He just watched her, his expression a mixture of shock, fury, and something else she couldn't name. Something that looked terrifyingly like pride. When he finally spoke, his voice was a raw whisper, barely audible over the distant sirens. You are the single most dangerous liability I have ever encountered, he paused, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone, a gesture so gentle it was a violent contradiction to the carnage around them. And I find I have no intention of letting you go. It wasn't a confession of love. It was a claim, a statement of fact in a world that had been shattered and rebuilt around the two of them. He saw the darkness in her, the same survival instinct that drove him, and he was marking it as his own.
The war had changed.
The enemy was no longer just his. They had seen her. They had tried to take her. The next move would be directly at her. In the back of that armored car, surrounded by death, Layla knew that her life was now irrevocably tied to his. Staying was no longer about survival. It was about seeing this through to the end. The final move came a week later. They had learned who she was, not just as a nurse, but as Layla. They found her mother in Atlanta. The message wasn't a threat delivered by a third party. It was a photo sent to one of Jin Woo's encrypted phones, which he had given to her. A picture of her mother walking out of a grocery store, a red circle drawn around her. Underneath, a single line of text, a debt must be paid. We will collect. Layla felt the world tilt on its axis. This was her fault. Her connection to him had painted a target on the back of the one person she loved most in the world. The fury that rose in her was cold and absolute. It burned away the last of her fear. They made a mistake, she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. She looked at Jin Woo, her eyes hard. They think she is your weakness. They don't realize she is mine. Jin Woo watched her, his expression grim. I have already sent my men. She is being moved to a secure location as we speak. She will be safe. Safe is not enough, Layla said. This doesn't end until they can't hurt anyone ever again. He saw the steel in her spine, the lethal promise in her eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod. I agree. The plan was audacious. It was hers. She had been listening, observing. She knew the rival boss had a specific medical condition, one that required regular treatments at a private clinic. She knew the schedule. She knew the layout. She used the medical knowledge that had once been her profession as a weapon. She would be the bait, but on her own terms. She walked into the clinic alone, dressed not in scrubs, but in a simple, elegant black dress he had provided. She looked like just another patient. She sat in the waiting room, her heart a steady, cold drum. She was no longer a nurse. She was a hunter. When the rival boss, a man named Choi, arrived with his guards, he saw her. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He thought she was a cornered animal. He didn't realize she was the lure for the trap. His men surrounded her, and he leaned in close, his voice a greasy whisper. Mr. Kwan sends a lovely gift. I'll be sure to send him back a piece of you when I'm done. Layla met his gaze and smiled, a chilling, empty expression. He didn't send me, she said softly. I came for you. That was the signal. From the adjoining rooms, Jin Woo's men emerged. The firefight was short, brutal, and contained. But Choi's personal bodyguard was better than the rest. He grabbed Layla, holding a knife to her throat, using her as a shield. Drop your weapon, Quan, or she dies, he screamed. Jin Woo stood 20 feet away, his gun leveled, his face a mask of cold fury. He was frozen. The ghost of the past, of Min-jun, the person he couldn't save, was in his eyes. He couldn't risk it. But Layla wasn't waiting to be rescued. She had anticipated this. She slammed the back of her head into the man's nose with all her strength. There was a sickening crunch. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She stomped down hard on his instep, driving her heel into the delicate bones of his foot. He roared, stumbling back. In that instant, she dropped and rolled away. The single gunshot from Jin Woo's weapon was the only sound. The man dropped, a neat hole in his forehead. It was over. The threat was gone. The room was silent, filled with smoke and the smell of death. Layla got to her feet, her body trembling with leftover adrenaline. Her old life was not just gone. It was a foreign country she could never visit again. The cost of her survival, of her mother's safety, was the woman she used to be. For him, the cost was laid bare in his eyes as he looked at her. The raw, terrifying vulnerability of having someone to lose again. He walked toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. He looked at her, not at the nurse he'd kidnapped, not at the liability he'd protected, but at the woman who had stood in the heart of the violence and refused to break. It is finished, he said, his voice low. Yes, she whispered. He reached into his jacket and pulled out, not a weapon, but a single, sleek black key card. He pressed it into her hand, his fingers closing around hers. This is not a cage, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he would never name. It is a choice. You belong with me, Layla. It wasn't a question. It was a truth that had been forged in blood and gunpowder, an acknowledgement of the darkness they shared. Later that night, she stood on the balcony of the penthouse. The city sprawled below, a river of light and sound, so close and yet so far away. Her old world was down there, living and breathing without her. She felt a pang of loss, sharp and deep, for the quiet girl in the light blue scrubs. But that girl couldn't have survived this. Jin Woo came to stand behind her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid, grounding weight at her back. He was her anchor in this new, dangerous world. She looked down at the key card in her hand, its black surface cool against her skin. It was the key to the penthouse, to this life, to him. He had said it was a choice, but they both knew the choice had already been made. It was made in a hospital ICU under the weight of his gaze. It was made in a bloody living room when she chose to stay. It was made in the back of a bullet-riddled car with a syringe in her hand. She didn't turn around. She just tilted her head back slightly, a silent acknowledgement. This was her home now. This man was her home now. The quiet nurse was gone, and in her place was a woman who knew the precise weight of a life in her hands and who was no longer afraid of the dark.